I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and I'd like to welcome you to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series program on Spinoza with Professor Stephen Nadler of the University of Wisconsin. He's the Villas Research Professor and William Hay Professor of Philosophy, as well as being the Director of the Institute for Research in the Humanities. He has written 20 books or more, 20 is the round number I have, a number of those on Spinoza, and as well as other books and other aspects of the history of philosophy. His book, Spinoza Alive, won the Koret Jewish Book Award, and you saw that on the pre-roll if you logged in ahead of time. His book, Rembrandt's Jews, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And Rembrandt is connected to this because, as you know, he lived in Amsterdam among Jewish families and painted and drew people from the Jewish community. Some of Professor Nadler's other books include Think Least of Death, with the subtitle being Spinoza on How to Live and How to Die. Another book on Spinoza, A Book Forged in Hell, Spinoza's Scandalous Treatise and the Birth of the Secular Age. His book on Menashe ben Israel, Rabbi of Amsterdam, also focused on the Amsterdam Jewish community. Professor Nadler's books have been translated into more than 20 languages. And among other honors, he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And it's a real pleasure for us today that you are here on the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. And Professor Nadler, welcome.
Thank you, Ron, for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me to talk today. Let's start sharing my screen. All right. So let me begin with a document that was read out probably in Portuguese, and our only extant record of it is a Portuguese version in the community record book of the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community. And this was an act that was proclaimed, let me see if I get rid of these pictures, an act that was proclaimed in July of 1656. The senhores of the Mahamad, that is the lay directors of the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, make known to you that having for some time reports of the bad opinions and acts of Baruch Spinoza, they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his bad ways. But being unable to effect any remedy, and on the contrary, each day receiving more information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught, and about the monstrous deeds which he performed, and having many trustworthy witnesses who have reported and testified on all of this in the presence of the said Spinoza, he who has been found guilty, after all of this has been examined in the presence of the rabbis, they, that is the members of the Ma'amad, have decided with the rabbis' consent, that the said Spinoza should be banned and separated from the nation of Israel, as they now put him under Herem with the following Herem. With the judgment of the angels and with that of the saints, we put under Herem, ostracize, and curse and damn Baruch de Spinoza, with the consent of blessed God and with the consent of this entire holy congregation before these holy scrolls, with the 613 precepts which are written therein, with the Herem that Joshua put upon Jericho, with the curse with which Elisha cursed the youth, and with all the curses that are written in the law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. Adonai will not forgive him, and the fury and zeal of Adonai will burn against this man and bring upon him all the curses that are written in this book of the law. And may Adonai erase his name from under the heavens, and may Adonai separate him from evil from all of the tribes of Israel, with all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law. And you that cleave unto Adonai your God, all of you alive today, we warn that no one should communicate with him orally or in writing, nor provide him any favor, nor be with him under the same roof, nor be within 4 cubits of him, nor read any paper composed or written by him. This act of herem, or expulsion or ban, we could also use the word excommunication, even though that's not really appropriate, since excommunication is really it's a Christian act, a Christian liturgical act, and Judaism doesn't have communion, so there's no excommunion. Whereas an act of herem is more than just a liturgical or religious action. It's a social, economic, and political action whereby the person put under herem is really outside the community. The notion of herem goes back to the biblical period where something is herem if it is out not to be used. You could be herem if you are holy. And so, for example, certain vessels are too sacred to be used in everyday activities. But also if something is cursed, if something is seen to be too wicked to be used. And so these objects were put outside of everyday use. But eventually, herem became a way of putting people outside, of ostracizing individuals. And by the 17th century, especially in Amsterdam, it became a very effective means of ruling a community and making sure things keep kosher in the broad sense. The herem was actually used quite extensively by the Amsterdam Portuguese Jews for reasons which I'll go into in a second. But if you were put under herem by this community, you would be outside of all economic and social activity. Nobody could talk to you. Should you happen to die while under herem, you would not be buried in the Jewish cemetery. And the community's book of rules specifies a long list of offenses for which somebody could be put under herem. Some of them are quite mundane, taking a book out of the library without permission, a Jewish woman caught cutting the hair of a Gentile woman would be put under herem. Sexual relations between Jews and Christians were forbidden by herem. So were theological discussions between Jews and Christians. More serious offenses, insulting or assaulting a rabbi. And I think one of the rules forbids members of the Sephardic Portuguese community from buying kosher meat from an Ashkenazic butcher. So relations between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim in Amsterdam were very tense, partly because, as we'll see in, oops, now I'm having trouble forwarding things here. Excuse me while I try to get this. Yeah, so, sorry, let me back up a bit. This herem was directed against Baruch Spinoza. He was born in Amsterdam in 1632, and he died relatively young in The Hague in 1677. Notice that the herem document only speaks of abominable heresies and monstrous deeds, but doesn't tell us what exactly they were. And so one of the great mysteries of scholarship around Spinoza is what exactly were his offenses? He was only 23 years old at the time. And as far as we know, he hadn't written anything. He certainly hadn't composed any of his philosophical treatises. So on the one hand, there's a bit of a mystery. Why was Spinoza put under herem with such prejudice? On the other hand, for anybody who's read his mature philosophical treatises, there really is no mystery here, because if he was saying around the time of the herem even some of the things that he puts into his philosophical treatises, then there's no question that he deserved this herem from the leaders and the rabbis of this community. Now, as I said, these Jews in Amsterdam used the herem rather frequently, perhaps more so than other Jewish communities in the period, let's say in Hamburg or Venice or Salonika. And part of the reason was that this was a community of Jews who were themselves former conversos or descendants of conversos. That is, the history of this community goes back to Spain and Portugal, and the forced conversion of Jews in Spain in 1492 and in Portugal in 1496. And eventually, a large number of these conversos which found life very difficult under the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, because the Inquisition was always suspicious that these conversions were not sincere. And so many of these conversos were tortured severely by the Inquisitions, which suspected that they were still practicing Judaism in secret. So eventually, many of the conversos leave Spain and Portugal, and they make their way to various ports of call around the Mediterranean, Fez in Morocco, Salonika in Greece, spots in France, in Italy, including Antwerp in the Low Countries. But eventually, by the beginning of the 17th century, there's a growing Jewish community in Amsterdam. And the reason why Amsterdam was so attractive was because the Dutch were willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that these were Jews practicing Judaism openly in their city. The Dutch saw the economic benefits of having a thriving Jewish community because many of these Sephardic Jews continued to maintain their mercantile networks with the New World and around the Mediterranean and the coast of Africa. And so they made a substantial contribution to the Dutch economy. If you look at this map I have here, oops, go back. Follow the cursor. This street here at the bottom was by the middle of the 17th century called the Jodenbreestraat, the Jews' Broad Street, because many of these houses along this street here were owned by some of the more wealthy Portuguese Jews, Jewish merchants, Jewish physicians, and other professionals. By the middle of the century, there was a greater influx of Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe. They were fleeing pogroms and other forms of intolerance, violent intolerance in Germany, in Poland, and Lithuania. And as these Jews arrived in Amsterdam, they tend to settle here in this square island where the homes were made of wood and not brick, and things were a little bit more crowded. Now, I said that the relationships between the Sephardic Jews and the Portuguese Jews and the Ashkenazic Jews were tense. And that's because these wealthy Sephardim were a bit embarrassed by the poor Ashkenazic Jews who were arriving in Amsterdam. Many of them were indigent and were begging on the streets. And it's telling, the nature of the relations between the two communities is telling in the sense that the Sephardic Jews actually took up charitable donations so that they can send the Ashkenazic Jews back to where they came from. So there was no love lost between these two communities. So the Sephardic or Portuguese Jews did use the Herem not just to maintain proper relations between themselves and the Ashkenazic Jews and themselves and the Dutch, but also within the community itself. Because of the Spanish and Portuguese backgrounds of many of the members of the community, they were raised as Catholics and had, for generations, had been cut off from Jewish texts, Jewish traditions. And so when they land in Amsterdam, they have to be re-educated into the ways of normative Judaism. And so the community used the Herem very frequently to try to impose some kind of Jewish communal life upon these, let's call them new Jews or returning Jews, who needed to learn that Purim should not be called the Feast of Saint Esther, or as a way of making sure that the community behaved itself and so that the Dutch would continue to tolerate them. So one of the regulations in the community specifies that these lavish and loud wedding celebrations should be turned down a bit, lest the Dutch get annoyed. And for most of the 17th century, there was a good deal of insecurity among the Amsterdam Jews for how they were perceived by the Dutch. I think they were afraid that just as they had been expelled by the Spanish in 1492, that the Dutch would become more intolerant if they found this to be a burdensome or irritating community. And so the Herem was used here not just to enforce religious conformity, but in a way to keep things proper within the community so that the Dutch would maintain their tolerant and respectful attitude toward them. And as we'll see, I think that may have played a role in the decision to put Spinoza under the Herem. This was the synagogue of the community up until 1675. So this would have been the synagogue in which Spinoza's Herem was read out loud. As after the Herem, Spinoza left Amsterdam and would go on to lead the life of a typical philosopher in the 17th century, composing his treatises, and these are his two most important philosophical masterpieces. On the left, you see the Ethica, the ethics, demonstrated in geometrical order. And this he, in fact, did not publish in his lifetime. He was about to, but he realized that his views on God here, which we'll talk about in a second, would have been much too scandalous. And the reason why he thought that is because the book on the right, the Theological Political Treatise, which he did publish in 1670, although he published it anonymously, he didn't put his name on the cover, and he actually had a false publisher and city on the cover. This book, the Theological Political Treatise, caused such a scandal. It was universally condemned, not just in the Dutch Republic, but across Europe, as an atheistic treatise, as a godless treatise, as a soul-destroying book. And one critic calls it a book forged in hell by the devil himself. So it's these two books in which Spinoza lays out his philosophical views. And so what I want to do today is use the Herem and try to, in an attempt to try to explain why Spinoza was put under Herem, use that as a framework for looking at 5 main theses of Spinoza's philosophy. So I want to use the Herem as a way of introducing you to the main points of Spinoza's philosophy. The first point, and this is primarily his argument in the Ethics, Spinoza denies that there is any such thing as a providential, wise, just, and bountiful God. That is, he denies the Abrahamic God of the Hebrew Bible. God, for Spinoza, does not have any of the psychological qualities or affections that are traditionally attributed to God. So God does not think things, God does not believe things, God does not have expectations, God does not issue commands for Spinoza. God does not look at us, God does not talk to us. These are anthropomorphic ways of portraying God, and to Spinoza, they are false and superstitious. God does not have a human psychological life, such as the God of the Bible has. The God in the Bible has emotions like anger and jealousy and vengeance. And this God is actually, the God of the Bible is occasionally ignorant of things. And this God can change its mind and so on. Just think of how Abraham was able to change God's mind about destroying, or tried to change God's mind about destroying the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. So first of all, Spinoza's God attributes of a providential God. Spinoza's God does not make plans. Second, Spinoza's God does not have any of the moral attributes of a providential God. Spinoza's God is not good or benevolent or wise or just or merciful. To think of God in those terms is, again, to attribute to God in a superstitious way human properties, human moral virtues. But God, according to Spinoza, is not a human-like agent. God is not a moral agent. God is nature. In fact, Spinoza's primary claim in the metaphysics of the ethics is that all there is nature. There is no such thing as the supernatural. Everything that is in nature, is a part of nature, and comes about through the laws of nature. Nature itself is eternal and infinite. It is necessarily existing. There was never a time when nature did not exist, and there will never be a time at which nature does not exist. Nature governs everything, and everything follows from nature's laws with absolute necessity. Some of the philosophers in the 17th century talked about other possible worlds, that God chose this world but could have chosen other worlds. Spinoza rejects that kind of God who makes choices. Spinoza's God does not have freedom of the will. This is the only possible world. Everything that is exists and happens with absolute necessity. Things could not possibly have been otherwise. There is no contingency in nature. There are no accidents. Nature is the inviolable causal principle of everything that happens. It follows from that miracles are absolutely metaphysically impossible. Now, what we mean ordinarily by a miracle is some kind of divine or supernatural violation or interruption of the course of nature. So when God allows Moses to part the Red Sea or saves Daniel from the lion's den, God is, in this case, interrupting or suspending the ordinary course of nature to make something happen for a providential cause. For Spinoza, this is not something that could possibly happen. I contrast Spinoza with another early modern philosopher. David Hume, an 18th century philosopher, said that there may be miracles, there may not have been miracles. But Hume's point is that you're never justified in believing in a miracle. Hume wants to make the epistemological point that because miracles, an event which is contrary to nature, is so implausible, so improbable, that you're never justified in believing in it. Spinoza goes much further than that. He wants to say not just that you're never justified in believing in a miracle, he wants to say miracles are absolutely metaphysically impossible. Because if God is nature and a miracle is supposed to be a supernatural act by God, that would be to say that nature departs from its own ways, and that's absurd. Nature cannot interrupt nature. So whatever happens, happens necessarily by the laws of nature. And the laws of nature are themselves absolutely necessary. Therefore, miracles are impossible. There can be no interruptions of anything that happens by natural causes. And everything has natural causes. Okay, so my kids made me say there's one exception. So that was the first thesis of Spinoza's philosophy, his conception of God. I think Spinoza is an atheist. Many interpreters over the centuries have preferred to call him a pantheist or panentheist. If you want to, in the Q&A part of our talk today, we can discuss that. But to me, Spinoza is an atheist. I think it's just wrong to think of him as trying to preserve any kind of divinity. He's not turning nature into the divine. I think he's eliminating the divine in favor of nature. All right, here's the second thesis of Spinoza's philosophy, second major thesis. God is not literally the author of the Bible, neither Hebrew scripture nor the Christian Gospels, neither directly nor through Moses and the prophets. Typically, the traditional understanding of the divinity of Scripture, the divinity of the Bible, is that God gave the Bible, not just the laws, but all of the agadot, the stories of the Hebrew Bible, to the prophets, to Moses. But obviously, Spinoza's God can't give anything to anybody because Spinoza's God is not a kind of person who gives commandments or tells stories or makes prophetic predictions of things. So God, for Spinoza, is not literally the author of the Bible. In fact, he says, the Bible is only a work of human literature. It is a compilation of human writings. There were many authors and many texts. Moses was an author of some of these writings. Some of the prophetic books, which bear the names of prophets like Isaiah, Nehemiah, and so on, there was a large collection of these human writings, and they were copied over the centuries, copy after copy after copy, handed down from one generation to the next. And over those centuries, as these texts are copied and handed down, errors creep in, things are changed, texts are lost, additions are made. And then finally, in the Second Temple period, a team of editors, led, Spinoza argues, by Ezra the scribe, makes a selection of these human writings and canonizes them and says, this is scripture. Obviously, a large number of texts were not included, and so the decision to include these texts rather than others was a rather historical and even political decision. But that means that the Bible as we have it now, whether now means in Spinoza's time or our time today, is just what Spinoza calls a corrupted and mutilated work of human literature. It's an anthology. There's a sense in which it's divine, but what Spinoza means by that is that it is divine because the authors of these literary texts, the prophets, were human beings who were especially ethical. They had very virtuous characters, but they were also endowed with especially vivid imaginations. Therefore, because they were men of high virtue who had a really good sense of morality, and because they had vivid imaginations, they were able to construct morally inspiring and ethically edifying stories. And so the Bible is a collection of these morally edifying stories. But Spinoza is very insistent on this second point. The prophets, the writers of these texts, were not philosophers, they were not scientists, and therefore their texts, the books of the Bible, are not sources about natural science, about the cosmos, about philosophical truths. They're not even sources of truths about God. The prophets had very simple and false beliefs about God. Some of them thought that God had a body and could sit on a throne or hand things. So we should not read the Bible as a source of truth. The Bible is divine only in the sense that the stories in the Bible are especially good at motivating us to being moral, that is, to loving other human beings and treating them with justice and charity. That's what, didn't mean to go for that. That's what moral behavior consists in, justice and charity towards others. However, I think it follows from this that it means the Bible is not necessarily unique in being divine. If you read Shakespeare's plays and these motivate you towards a more moral life, towards treating other people ethically, or if you read the novels of Jane Austen or Charles Dickens or any inspiring work of human literature, and it moves you to justice and charity, then those novels are divine. And in a way, Spinoza is saying the Bible is just another novel or anthology of short stories, which is divine in the sense that it moves us ethically. So there's the second major thesis of Spinoza's philosophy. And you're starting to see why he may have earned the Herem. Here's the third point. Spinoza argues that Jewish law, halakha, is no longer binding on latter-day Jews. This is because Jewish law was instituted by a certain political leader, Moses, at a very specific historical and political moment in Israelite history. During the Exodus from Egypt, Moses had to unite these tribes, give them something to live for, something to work for, and an ambition to create a unified state. And so the laws that Moses instituted not just dietary laws, laws about fabrics and clothing, but especially laws about worship in the temple, are geared towards creating a unified, stable, and secure Jewish or Israelite commonwealth. But with the destruction of the temples, the Jewish commonwealth came to an end. There were no longer any Jewish kingdoms. There was no Jewish unity. And therefore, all of those ceremonial laws, all of those rituals, even the dietary prescriptions and proscriptions, lost their foundation. And so Spinoza argues that Jewish law, the Torah, all of the 613 commandments, are a historical curiosity and were valid during a certain historical period, but not anymore. And to continue to observe them is just to continue to participate in superstitious behavior that is meaningless and has nothing to do with true piety or true religion. Because true religion and true piety is simply a matter of loving your neighbors and treating them with justice and charity. What you eat, what clothes you wear, how you worship or pray, what texts you read have nothing to do with true religion. It's simply a matter of virtuous living. Finally, here's one of Spinoza's doctrines, which I think was probably the really aggravating factor behind the decision to put him under Herem. Spinoza argues that there is no such thing as personal immortality, immortality of the soul, or any kind of world to come. There is no heaven in which the virtuous are rewarded. There is no hell in which the vicious are punished. These are superstitious and imaginary things. This is an especially important point in Spinoza's philosophy because he thinks that if you believe in the immortality of the soul, if you think that there's a world to come, then your life in this world will be governed by irrational passions, and especially the passions of hope and fear. If you believe in immortality and a heaven and a hell, your life is going to be governed by the hope for that eternal reward and the fear of eternal punishment. And those hopes and fears are going to lead you to throw yourself at the mercy of ecclesiastics, preachers, priests, rabbis, or imams, because these clerics, these religious authorities, are telling you that they know how you can get to heaven and avoid hell. And so the belief in immortality not only puts you in a kind of bondage to your irrational passions, a kind of personal psychological bondage, but it will also lead you into a social, political, and religious bondage to church or synagogue authorities. And that is really detrimental to our freedom and well-being. Because a person who is free is a person who does what they do, not because some authority tells them to do it, and not because some irrational hopes or fears lead them to do it, but because they know it's the right thing to do. The more rational you are, the more virtuous you are, the more your life is guided by what you know and not how things happen to make you feel. And that life of freedom, that life of rationality, the life of virtue, is also what Spinoza calls blessedness, happiness, and salvation. So he takes these traditional religious notions and gives them a perfectly naturalistic understanding. To be blessed is to enjoy the life of rational freedom, to be self-governing, to act in a way where what you do follows from what you know and not from your emotions. Spinoza does allow that there is a kind of eternity for us, we become eternal the more rational and knowledgeable we become. Because to become rational and knowledgeable is to learn truths, and especially to learn eternal truths, truths of mathematics, truths of science, truths of metaphysics, truths of philosophy, and especially truths about morality. And a person who apprehends these truths, who increases their knowledge and their understanding of the world, and especially their understanding that everything in nature is necessitated by nature's laws, this person participates in a kind of eternity because the truths they see are eternal truths. But Spinoza is very careful to say there's nothing personal about this eternity. It's just the eternity of knowledge itself. There's nothing personal about knowing that 1 + 1 = 2, or that piety consists in justice and charity. There's no immortality here. There's nothing about you that persists after this life. When you're dead, Spinoza is saying, you're dead, period. And therefore, your focus should be not on some alleged rewards for virtue in an afterlife, but the benefits of virtue in this life. What are these benefits? Well, first of all, they're social and political benefits, because the more virtuous you are, the more you help other people become virtuous, rational, and free. And the more you surround yourself with virtuous, free, and rational people. And that's in everybody's best interest. Secondly, the more virtuous and rational you are, the more you understand about the cosmos, the more you see the necessity of things, the more you recognize that everything is a part of nature and happens by means of nature's eternal and necessary laws. And when you see that, eventually you acquire a kind of peace of mind, an equanimity, tranquility in the face of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. You no longer get overwhelmingly upset about things you lose that you valued, or overly overjoyed about the things you love. You recognize that so much that happens in life is outside of your control. And so there's a very stoic lesson to be learned here through virtue and reason. And so among the rewards of eternity, among the rewards of virtue in this life, is blessedness, happiness, peace of mind, and what he calls salvation. Spinoza's reaction to his ban was allegedly this. One early 17th century writer says, this is what Spinoza said: "All the better. They do not force me to do anything that I would not have done of my own accord if I did not dread scandal. But since they want it that way, I enter gladly on the path that is opened to me, with the consolation that my departure will be more innocent than was the exodus of the early Hebrews from Egypt." Those various theses of Spinoza's philosophy that we looked at, if Spinoza was saying anything like those around the time of the ban, he knew that this was coming. I don't think he had any misapprehensions. He knew the rules of the game, and I don't think he was surprised at all. He probably received various warnings. And we do, in fact, have some reason for thinking that he was saying around the time of the Herem in mid-1650s, that he was saying those kinds of things that we saw appear later in his philosophical writings. We have the testimony from several visitors to Amsterdam in the late 1650s who, they were Spanish visitors, and they said they met this man named Spinoza. And when they went back to Spain, they were interviewed by the Inquisition, because the Inquisition was still interested in what was happening among these former conversos, who may still have had relatives in Spain and Portugal. So the Inquisition, always on the lookout for false conversos, that is, conversos still practicing Judaism in secret. They were interested in what was going on in Amsterdam in this community of former conversos. And so the testimony of these two Spanish visitors, when they returned to Spain from Amsterdam, they told us that Spinoza was saying things like, God exists only in a philosophical sense, that the law is not true, that is, that Torah is not true, and the soul dies with the body. And these are very like the things that we find in his philosophical treatises. So I think there are very good reasons why, very good reasons for thinking that Spinoza was, around the time of the Herem, saying just those things. Let me go back. There's something I meant to say here as well. If Spinoza was indeed denying the immortality of the soul around 1650 and 1656, typically, this is not a halakhic question. The immortality of the soul is a matter of philosophy, of metaphysical speculation. And there is no single Jewish or rabbinic tradition. In fact, usually there's a great deal of latitude for what one may say about the soul, its immortality, and even about the world to come. Maimonides, for one, says that those who speculate on the world to come will have no place in the world to come. There are some rabbinic traditions which stress very heavily personal immortality and divine reward in the world to come. But there are other equally authoritative rabbinic traditions which stress the focus on this world and not on immortality, and even rabbinic figures who deny that there is such a thing as a personal immortal soul. So traditionally, this would be an issue on which one would be given a good deal of latitude. It's speculative, it's not halakhic. The problem was that Amsterdam in the 1650s was the wrong place and the wrong time to be denying the immortality of the soul. First of all, each of the four rabbis in the community at this period, Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, Rabbi Isaac Abu Abda Fonseca, Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, and Rabbi Samuel Aguilar, each of them wrote a book, a treatise, defending the immortality of the soul. This was an important issue for the Spanish and Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam, because many of them, having been raised in Catholic environments, brought a lot of that Catholic dogma, that Catholic theological beliefs to their Judaism. And so they imported perhaps a Catholic doctrine of personal immortality into their Judaism. Moreover, they also had relatives back in Spain and Portugal who were committing the grievous sin of denying their Judaism by being conversos and practicing only in secret. And so a lot of the Amsterdam Jews were concerned about the eternal fate of these relatives who were committing such a sin back in Iberia. And so they had faith that, at least in the world to come, these Jews would get their final reward as Jews. So the doctrine of immortality and eternity in a world to come was very important to the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam. Moreover, remember that they are a refugee community in a Calvinist nation, the Dutch Republic. And the Calvinists took personal immortality very seriously. And I think that perhaps one of the decisions, or among the decisions to put Spinoza under Herem, was if he was denying personal immortality, the leaders of the Jewish community might have been a little nervous that the Dutch would come down hard upon them for harboring somebody who denies a doctrine which is central to Calvinism. In other words, this might have been a political, the decision to ban Spinoza might have been a political maneuver, a way of waving their hands to the Dutch and saying, don't worry, we can keep our house clean. We are not going to be a haven for heretics. That might have been, I think, a very important dimension of the decision to ban Spinoza. Finally, Spinoza has often been said to be a philosopher whose tenets in a way, are forerunners of many of the values that we take dear today. And especially for us, those of us living in America, and for us now, who knows what the future holds, but the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of expression and freedom of association and freedom of religion. And the No Establishment Clause says that the state shall not take any steps to establish or formalize religious practices, nor in the Free Exercise Clause shall the state interfere with the free exercise of religion. Now, Spinoza was an extraordinarily important proponent and defender of freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and toleration. No question about that. However, and in fact, one of the great moments, I think, in Spinoza's writings is at the end of the Theological Political Treatise. He says that in the state, everyone should be free to think what they want and to say what they think. And that's just an extraordinary proposition for the 17th century. However, I think it's a mistake to think of Spinoza as somebody who's in favor of the separation of church and state. Spinoza did think that everybody should be free to believe whatever they want about God or not believe in God at all, and they should be free to worship God or not worship God in their own private ways. However, he did believe that when it comes to public worship, in the establishment of public churches, the state has the right to control that. Because when you're talking about public affairs, you're talking about civil welfare, actions and practices that impinge upon the well-being of the community. And that is what the state ought to oversee. And therefore, to the extent that religious worship becomes a public affair, the state has the right to control it. So I don't think we should see Spinoza as tolerant and as in favor of freedom of expression as he is, as somebody who accepts the separation, the full separation of church and state. What he is arguing for in the end is for us to make a choice. By the way, this is the manuscript of the Ethics of Spinoza. Up until just a few years ago, we had no existing manuscript of Spinoza's Ethics. But this one was discovered in the Vatican, and it was the one that the Roman Catholic Church used to condemn Spinoza. What Spinoza's philosophy is giving you is a choice. Are we going to be devoted to a life of reason? That is a life of freedom, a life where we do what we do because of what we know and what we understand to be true and what is in our own best interest? A life in which we are guided by science and by truths about the world and about ourselves? Or are we going to be guided by a life of irrational passions? On the left, you see an etching depicting, or sorry, an engraving depicting the assassination of the Dutch political leader in 1672. The Dutch were at war with France. France had invaded the Republic at this time. The political leader was accused of treason, of allowing the Dutch to enter, and so he was literally torn apart by a mob in The Hague in 1672. And this is one of those events which led Spinoza to great mistrust of the multitude, of the masses. Are we going to be led by reason, or are we going to be led by a life of irrational passions? The image on the right needs no commentary. This is the choice that Spinoza is giving us, and I think we should be under no misapprehensions about which life he thinks we should follow. I will stop there, and thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. And wow, we left us a lot to think about. And the questions here, let's see, I'm getting to them. The first question, I think you've answered it really, but the first question is, why were the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam so insecure?
Yeah. Well, because they were a refugee community, and it's not like everybody in the Dutch Republic wanted them there. The more conservative and orthodox leaders of the Dutch Reformed Church were against allowing Jews to settle openly. And this was an ongoing conflict within the Dutch Republic during the 17th century between these conservative preachers and the more liberal regions, that is, the secular individuals who tended to govern cities like Amsterdam and Haarlem. And so I think in one sense, I think that this question is a very good one, because the Jews did not need to be so insecure. There was no way that the Dutch were going to make the same mistake that Spain made. When Spain expelled its Jews, it made a really bad economic miscalculation. And the Dutch were much too smart. So there was really no chance that the Dutch were going to expel this Jewish community, which was making such an economic contribution. But nonetheless, they were refugees. Most of them were not technically allowed to become citizens. And so they felt that their status here remained insecure right through the beginning of the 18th century. Jewish emancipation in the Dutch Republic would not happen until the end of the 18th century, when Napoleon invaded the Dutch Republic. And under the terms of French governance, the Jews were emancipated.
Eric Brodsky asked about the penalties for the Herem. And he mentions people being lashed or trampled on by the members of the synagogue, things like that. Can you comment on what were the penalties for a Herem?
For most of the harems that you would get, it was pretty mild. I listed a bunch of offenses: cutting hair, sexual relations, buying from the wrong butcher, and so on. Usually the penalty was you paid a fine and you apologized for your transgression. And the herem would be lifted after a couple of days or a couple of weeks, depending upon the seriousness. There is one instance where an individual's memoir, he reports that he was lashed and then forced to lie his body prostrate over the entrance to the synagogue while everybody walked out on his body. I don't know of any other records of such extremely violent penalties. In Spinoza's case, the penalty was, his Herem document far exceeds any other Herem from the period, without question. It's the longest, it's the most vitriolic, it's full of curses that you don't find in other Herems in this period. And it's also final. There's no mention of anything Spinoza could do to reintegrate himself into the community. But the notion of a violent penalty, that would have been the exception rather than the rule.
We have a couple of questions from anonymous attendees that are actually related. One of them says, is there evidence that Spinoza's philosophy formed at least part of the foundation for today's Reconstructionist views of God and Judaism, and the other one, today's humanistic Judaism?
So those are really interesting questions. It's sometimes said that Spinoza laid the foundations for secular Judaism, for Reform Judaism, for Reconstructionist Judaism. That is Judaism that makes accommodations not just to the modern world, but to secular living, and maybe even Judaism without strong theology. One question is the historical question. Do Reconstructionist Jews, does Reform Judaism see itself as a legacy of Spinoza? That's one question which I don't have an answer to. I imagine there are a lot of people out there who would say yes. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of people who identify themselves as secular Jews, and that is whose self-identity is formed by Judaism, by being part of a certain history and tradition, but who have no religious component. A lot of secular Jews see themselves as the heirs of Spinoza. That's the historical question. But the philosophical question is different. And as I read Spinoza, the notion for him of secular Judaism or Reform or Reconstructionist Judaism would be incoherent, because for him, Judaism is the law. Without the law, there is no Judaism. And so in arguing that the law is no longer valid and that Jews in his time are now simply paying fealty to superstitious ceremonies. I think what Spinoza envisioned was not secular Judaism, but secular individuals, individuals for whom sectarian religion plays no role whatsoever in their self-identity.
Carol Damon asks about this concept of immortality in Spinoza, and saying that it sounds like this is coming through a Christian prism. Um, so it just asking, do you think he was, to what extent do you think he was influenced by Christian thought?
I think, well, because Spinoza denies immortality, he would be denying that aspect of Christianity. What I was suggesting was that the members of the Sephardic community in Amsterdam who put a good deal of emphasis on immortality, their Judaism was often, I'll use the word infected, no offense intended to anybody. Their Judaism was often infused with Catholic principles like that. So, the Feast of Saint Esther, there are no saints in Judaism and so on. But to go back to Carol's question, I think Spinoza was deeply influenced by Christian thinking because for him, the most superb prophet was Jesus. Moses was a great prophet, but even all of the Jewish prophet, all the Israelite, Hebrew, and Jewish prophets, Spinoza insists, were not philosophically gifted. Many of them were ignorant people, but they had ethical virtue and vivid imaginations, and so they could spin morally edifying stories. Jesus alone was a prophet who was also a philosopher. And Jesus saw the truth because in Jesus' sermons, you see explicit references to piety as involving justice and loving kindness. And so Spinoza thinks that Jesus saw God's message, the divine message, love your neighbor, more clearly and with greater understanding than anybody else. And so he holds up Jesus' sermons and even Paul's letters as really as paradigms of religious piety.
Ellen Fox also asks about what seems to be a relationship with Buddhist practice and Buddhist. Can you comment on that?
I wish I could. I'm always asked that, and I don't know enough about Judaism to say anything responsible about that.
Buddhism.
Everyone about Buddhism. What did I say? Judaism? Yeah, about Buddhism. But I'm told that there's a great deal of resonance between Spinoza's views on the unity of God, which is called his monism, our relationship to nature, and the nature of happiness and so on the one hand, and Buddhism on the other. But I have much to learn about that, so I'm happy to hear from others.
And there is a question about the effort to reverse the Herem on Spinoza.
I knew somebody was going to ask about that.
Uh,
So it happens like once every 50 years. Somebody in Israel goes to Mount Scopus and says, I hereby lift the Herem, or some rabbi says, Spinoza, you are our brother. So here's the thing. And first of all, let me preface this by saying that I'm absolutely against Herems. I don't think anybody should ever be punished or ostracized for their philosophical or religious or views. Opinions, we should be absolutely free to think what we want and to express our opinions. So keep that in mind when I say what I'm about to say. Spinoza knew the rules of the game. And within the rules of that game, the rabbis of 17th century Amsterdam, they knew what they were doing. They knew what Spinoza was saying. And so within the rules of that game, Spinoza got the Herem, and he probably deserved it given the community's rules. Now, about 10 years ago, first of all, the only authority that can lift the Herem is the Amsterdam Portuguese community, because it can be lifted only by the people who've pronounced it. So about 10 years ago, a member of the Amsterdam Portuguese community said, we should reconsider the Herem. We should lift it. And so the leaders, the directors of the community, put together an advisory committee. And that committee was me and three other Spinoza scholars or historians. And we were each asked to report what was Spinoza's philosophy, what were the reasons for the Herem, what are the advantages of lifting it, and what might be reasons not to lift it. And three out of the four of us said the Herem, there's no compelling reason to lift the Herem. First of all, a Herem is a social and economic ostracism of a living person. Spinoza's dead, and so it's meaningless to lift a Herem against somebody who's no longer living. Secondly, Spinoza's own response would say, I couldn't care less. Do what you want. It means nothing to me. So he wouldn't care whether it was lifted. Thirdly, the rabbis who issued the Herem knew much better than we do what the reasons for it. And so when the current rabbi of the community, so there was an event in Amsterdam after we issued our reports. There was a big event in Amsterdam. We were all brought to Amsterdam. 500 people showed up, and among the panelists was the present rabbi. And this rabbi decided in the end that the Herem was not to be lifted. And he said it would be an act of arrogance for me to overrule my 17th century colleagues. They knew what they were doing. He says, am I that much wiser than them that I can lift the Herem? So he decided not to lift it. And I think that was essentially the right decision. But again, not because I'm in favor of Herems, but as a matter of history.
Rabbi Dov Gartenberg has a couple of questions. One of them you alluded to earlier, the relationship between Spinoza and Maimonides.
Right.
You touched on that briefly. And the second question they had was he sanctioned by any other religious authorities, Spinoza?
Yeah, well, his books were put on the index of prohibited books by the Vatican.
Right.
So, I mean, they couldn't excommunicate him because he wasn't a Christian.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was put on that list. But, he was in good company. Every philosopher of the 17th century was on that list. Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, and so on. Maimonides was a crucial influence on Spinoza. And I think, despite the Herem, I think it's perfectly legitimate, even necessary, to think of Spinoza as participating in the history of Jewish philosophy. There have been scholars who have tried to understand Spinoza's writings without looking at the Jewish context, and especially without looking at the Jewish medieval rationalist context. People like Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon, or Gersonides, Levi ben Gershom. You really can't understand a lot of what Spinoza says without putting it in a Maimonidean context. A lot of what he says about virtue, happiness, rationality, and so on. Extremely important.
We have so many more questions. Let's see if we can get to a couple of them. Let's see. Marcia Torben asks, why did Spinoza conclude that nature and the laws of nature always were and always will be? I mean, did he see them as being fixed? Did he ever consider that there was a source of the laws of nature?
No.
No. Okay.
To get the full argument, you'd have to read the part one of the Ethics. But essentially, his argument is that nature is one thing, and it's what he calls a substance. And to be a substance, to be a truly, this is the basic metaphysical category from Aristotle onward. To be a substance, you have to be self-subsistent. You have to be really real, a real thing. Nature is the most real thing. But to be really real and to be self-subsistent and independent and to have that kind of ontological foundation, you have to be eternal, because if something causes you to come into being, you're dependent upon whatever causes you. And if nature is dependent upon something else as its cause, then it's not really real. It's dependent upon something else. But I mean, I can only give you a taste now. It's a beautiful argument. The first 15 propositions of Spinoza's Ethics are his argument that there is only one substance. That substance is God. but God, it'll turn out, as the ethics shows, God is just what nature is.
I'm looking through, there's so many more questions. This was a stimulating talk. It created more questions I think we've ever had. And I know that our time, we've really gone beyond our time. Um, so Scott Nadler asked,
Is he a relative? I don't know.
I'm wondering, what is your best hypothesis about what he actually did that provoked the harem? Well, you mentioned that before. It's probably the same things he wrote about later.
Yeah, so let me just say there's some scholars who argue that the harem was provoked by financial irregularities. When his father died, he inherited all these debts with the family business. And a lot of these debts were to Jewish merchants and a lot of them were to Dutch merchants. And Spinoza realized he couldn't possibly handle these debts. And so he went above the heads of the Jewish community to the Dutch authorities, had himself declared an orphan as a minor, which was legal according to Dutch law. But that meant he was abandoning his fiscal responsibilities. And so one argument is that the reason for the harem was that he violated the laws of the community by avoiding these debts. It's a very interesting hypothesis, but I don't think it explains the length and the vitriol of the harem. And the harem also says abominable heresies. I think the harem was provoked by his ideas about God, Jewish law, and the soul.
We could go on for much longer, but this has been so enlightening and stimulating. And Professor Nadler, thank you for your comments, the way you've led us through his thought and the understanding of the harem. And we appreciate your being here today with the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for all the great questions. I see there's a lot. Feel free to email me if you want to ask your question.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.